these people, these editors, these scoundrels, should be forced to drive round to everyone's house that they are rejecting and arrive on the door. They have to drive up in a bashed up, rusty Nissan Micra.
Absolutely.
That has to be the law. And they have to look into your eyes and they have to apologise. And while they're doing that, there has to be a visible blob of Marmite on their clothing.
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing and writers from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Julia Copus, a poet and a Royal Literary Fund Fellow. In this series, we take a deep dive, along with our guest writer, into the Royal Literary Fund audio archive. And together we listen in on other writers as they reflect on their experiences and creative processes. And then we respond to what we hear. Now, the archive is quite special, I think, because it offers an unusually candid perspective on the writing life. The day-to-day business of writing, the joys, the despairs, and the nuts and bolts of how people go about this mysterious business of putting words on the page and getting paid for it. So I'm really delighted to have with me today the Costa Award-winning poet Jonathan Edwards. And the Costa judges said of Jonathan's work that it is joyous, brilliant, and moving. This is a poet to celebrate. His poetry draws on his Welsh heritage and blends personal experiences with broader social and cultural themes. His most recent book is Jen. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Absolutely lovely to be here.
Now, as well as being a poet, we were talking beforehand about how you've had a proper job, in inverted commas, as an English teacher. And I believe that you now teach creative writing in various settings and mentoring too. So that means that you can share your passion for words both in the classroom or the workshop, as well as more publicly, via your books. So I thought, to get us thinking about the significance of teachers and teaching in our lives, we could have a listen to novelist and playwright Babs Horton addressing her teachers directly in a letter.
Well, you were a motley bunch, but then I went to 7 different schools, so at least I had plenty of variety. Mr. Andrews, you were by far the most exciting of them all. But if you were around today, you'd probably be preparing for a court case or life without a pension. I expect you knew we called you Archie Andrews after the ventriloquist dummy on television, who also wore a suit and a monocle. It was rumoured that you were in the First World War and still had shrapnel inside you. When a car backfired or another class did percussion and set to with the cymbals, you used to cover your head with your hands, and we had to run for Mr. Tibbs, the caretaker, who gave you some strong-smelling medicine from a hip flask. I liked the way you turned off your hearing aid when you wanted to read the newspaper, or we were getting on your nerves. Those hours of freedom were when I first nurtured dreams of becoming a writer. While bedlam ensued around me, I used to write long stories or daydream about adventures I would have when I could afford a compass, a map, a dog, and some stout shoes. When you did decide to teach, your lessons were brilliant, especially the Second World War ones, where you taught us how to make goggles by turning our hands backwards and making holes with our thumb and fingers. We flew around the playground humming the Dam Busters tune. Da 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 da, meow. And in the classroom, you hung loads of metal aeroplanes from the ceiling on string. And when we reenacted the Battle of Britain, you staggered around the room swinging them round and round. Take that, kapow, bang! As well as learning about history, it was good for our reflexes because we had to be on the ball and duck, or else you could get killed or just knocked out, like Vivian Price-Jones, who always sat up straight and took a direct hit between the eyes from a German Fokker. And the books you read to us were terrifying and thrilling. At night, I swear I would hear Blind Pew from Treasure Island tapping his stick along our road, coming to our house with a black spot for my mother. Or Bertha Mason, the madwoman from Jane Eyre, shuffling around in the attic above my head, striking matches. For years after, whenever I went to the lavatory, I flapped my arms about to check that the invisible man hadn't taken his bandages off and was hiding in there. You told us to read anything we could get our hands on. And I did. It was excellent advice, although the books my Auntie Edith kept under her bed were forcibly removed from my grasp. There were other teachers who inspired me, scared me witless, or wounded me with their sarcasm. You have a special place in my heart.
So Babs Horton there owning up to not being perhaps the most attentive of students, but even so being stimulated, terrified and inspired by the lessons of her history teacher, Mr. Andrews. Did you have any similarly inspiring teachers when you were at school, John?
Yeah, very definitely. I mean, I almost think the purpose of education is not really to improve knowledge or understanding. It's just to give you exposure to slightly eccentric older people, and it might do anything unpredictable at any moment. Yeah, I had a really, really brilliant secondary school English teacher he had kind of metallic purple MG Roadster that would appear in a puff of smoke, every morning.
Fantastic.
And he was like, he'd wear these loafers, he had long hair, kind of shabby, completely different to all the other teachers, would fall asleep in afternoon lessons with his mouth wide open and his head back in a sort of slightly dangerous way. And people would kind of see if they could throw paper into his mouth.
I knew you were going to say that, yeah.
But he did what he did. I mean, among things he did, I just loved those lessons because they were so kind of madcap. But among things that I can remember him doing was that he took us around the school. This would have been in the summer term when I was sort of 11, 12, something like that. We had amazing kind of school grounds, which just went on forever and had rivers and mountains. And they were much better than the classrooms, if I'm honest. But he took us around the school and he got us to stop at sort of several points and close our eyes. And there's something magical about doing that with 30 people anyway, and listen and really listen to bird song, to the river, to even the cars in the distance, and then make notes and write a sound poem out of that experience. Well, that's definitely stayed with me and really just formed my notions of what poetry is, that poetry is about paying attention to the world and it's about sound and music, but it's also kind of like a festival, like it's a special thing, it's a special day. It's not like the humdrum of being in a classroom every day. It's something like you're given, which is kind of awesome.
Yeah, almost a permission to pay attention and to listen.
Yeah.
Well, I'm surprised you didn't end up with sort of 30 poets out of that class. But I do think it's striking how many times teachers are sort of name-checked by people who've achieved some, in some field, like sportsmen or musicians, writers, and so on. And actually, I live with a teacher, and I've witnessed this firsthand. People coming up to him and saying, "So you changed my life," and he's desperately trying to remember their name. I mean, and also they, some of the students mean a lot to him. But for me, for instance, it was my Latin teacher, Mr. Barber, who sort of saved me in a way, I think. But I'm really interested in your writing and how that connects with your teaching and how you think they work together. Do you find that there are conflicts between the two roles, or do you find that they enrich one another?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, really, because I don't think I ever would have, when I was younger, or even now, if I'm honest, I would have thought of teaching as what I was keen to do or what I was kind of naturally predisposed to. But I sort of ended up in it, really. I mean, partly because I thought it would work well alongside writing, and I was in secondary school teaching for about 15 years, and there were lots of ways in which that definitely helped writing. I mean, I wrote 2 books during that time. I mean, part of it was, something as humdrum actually as the scheduling of the academic year, which gives you a clear demarcation between money work and kind of freedom to write, keeping those two things separate and being able to do both.
That's interesting, because I think a lot of writers struggle with that, freelance.
Yeah, and I think freelance is much more difficult because you're kind of like, your head is like a spinning plate. As soon as you've stacked up enough financial work to do that for a while, then you worry about your writing, you get back to your writing, you think, oh goodness, now I haven't got anything to write, and you've got to build up momentum with that. On this subject, I love Dylan Thomas's letters. I mean, Dylan Thomas had a kind of self-imposed chaotic lifestyle for all sorts of reasons, but I think those letters are amazing things to read if you're a freelancer, because the sorts of things that he's doing in terms of trying to build up money work, trying to manage time, trying to get money in a lot of the time is I don't think a lot of that's changed, if I'm honest, So there's a kind of incredibly subversive education course in how to be a freelancer in reading Dylan Thomas's letters, I think.
Very good tip. I might go back to them. Thinking about writing workshops that you teach now, there are a lot of writing workshops out there, so a lot of competition. I just wonder if you have any particular practical strategies for building success as a workshop practitioner.
To be honest with you, the things that I do, I don't really do anything particularly complicated or innovative. I think a massive amount is down to the text that you pick as prompts. So really the quality of the poems that you're putting in front of the workshop group. I think it's partly about creating an environment in which people feel comfortable. So I always start, and this is not innovative, you'll see this in any workshop that you go to. I always start with automatic writing. And then it's down to really, I think, what you put in front of them as a poem and the discussion that you can have and where that leads to. A lot of the models I'm doing are around kind of co-teaching with all sorts of writers, fiction writers and so on. And I see really wonderfully sort of innovative approaches to teaching. One that I stole recently actually was a fiction writer who got people to draw the story and the events in the story before they wrote. And I loved that. I loved that idea so much.
So it taps into a different part of the brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just relaxes. And I mean, I can't draw for toffee, but...
I don't think that matters. I hope it doesn't, yeah.
So I do things now where I'll do actually I did last week, got them to draw the map of a journey that they'd like to write about, which could be a walk that they love to do or, even the work commute or something. Just draw a little map of that. And then we looked at Fiona Benson poem called Village, which is about a walk around a village, and some other poems about journeys. I think a really beautiful Thomas Lux poem about driving to work, and then wrote from the map, basically used the map to construct the poem, which was lovely.
Well, you've mentioned two poets that I love there, so I'm now thinking, can I get Fiona on to the podcast? One of the things that your own poetry has been praised for, your own writing in general, is its musicality. And we're going to take a listen now to poet Lawrence Sale talking to me, in fact, and enthusing about the wonderful musical control of Emily Dickinson in her poem, I Could Die to Know.
There are only two I's, I think, in the whole poem, one in the first line and one in the last.
Yes.
So it's bookended by that first person, but largely away from it. Yes, it seems to me a wonderful example of that facet of her work which uses rhythm and punctuation, almost like, as I mentioned earlier, as a musical score. It actually, she conducts the reader.
Yes.
You can't get away from that. It's extraordinary, and it is very musical. It's very definite, and there's no uncertainty about that in her work at all.
No, her directions are very precise, aren't they?
Yes, yeah. And I mean, as you said, it particularly comes home in a sense to roost in that the poise, the way in which the orchestra is brought down to a still hush at the end is quite extraordinarily accomplished. But again, as you have noticed before, with the simplest of words, her vocabulary. I mean, the sense of the everyday here is very straightforward, isn't it? And then the relationship between the here of the poet's position and all that is observed in a quite apparently objective, detached way from the outside.
Yes, yeah, the there of the rest of the poem.
Yes, yes.
Interestingly, the auditory is experienced, isn't it? You can hear all these things. A lot of the visual is imagined.
Yes, quite. Yes.
Which is, it's all a possibly
yes, exactly.
This moment.
Yes.
Yeah. And it comes back again to that word control, doesn't it?
Yes. Yes.
She has supreme control over it.
Yes. And it shows up particularly in a poem like this where I'm sorry, I was rather...
No, that's fine.
Where, as you rightly say, that it is, if not chaotic, then there's a lot of looseness, there's a lot going on, quite daring, and it does read much more like a contemporary poem from that point of view. But then the daring and the actually sort of calling the orchestra back of the ending, is just wonderful. Yes.
There's a kind of rallentando, isn't there?
Yes, exactly.
Slowing down.
I knew there was a word for it.
Yes.
It is exactly that, yes.
Yeah.
You can imagine someone reading this while I dream here.
Yeah.
You can imagine the poet looking up at the audience very slowly and smiling slightly.
But also that ellipsis at the end,
Yes.
kind of launching off into nothingness again.
Yes, quite. Yeah.
She conducts the reader, Lawrence said there. And I think that's an interesting idea. The poem as a kind of musical score that the poet is sort of in charge of. So I'll ask you about that in a moment, but just thinking briefly about the role of music in your own life. There are quite a lot of musical references in your poems to various bands and so on, and to karaoke. And I've heard somewhere that you were in a band yourself at one point. Is that right?
Yeah. So I mean, it was basically when I was studying A level. So I mean, this is a point. So it's late 90s. So the music scene actually around Newport was quite interesting. So this is shortly after bands like the 60 Foot Dolls and the Manic Street Preachers were coming through and so on, who actually, I mean, the Manic Street Preachers inform a lot of the political position of the poems, or even just the idea to write poems in the first place, to be honest. But yeah, that was a really, really vibrant scene. There was a wonderful nightclub called TJ's in Newport. So it was chaotic and wonderful and brash. And I think part of the path to becoming a poet, really. Yeah.
Sounds like a good recipe for poetry. Wonderful, chaotic and brash. Yeah, or a certain type anyway. But going back to the clip, this idea of conducting the reader. I mean, I think it's true that as poets, we have a lot of tools to hand to control the music of words in quite a precise way, or how they are read. You know, at the end of a line, for instance, there's always that tiny pause, isn't there, before the reader moves on to the next line. And then thinking about the sort of wider suite of musical effects, rhythm, rhyme, repetition, echo, alliteration, word length, line length, all of that. How consciously do you make use of sonic devices in your poems? Or, you know, do you let the music have more control and suggest things to you?
Yeah, exactly. It's the second one of those. So I tend to think of music as a way of giving a poem a kind of individual life, which hopefully and ideally is beyond me and out of my control. So it's a way of kind of setting the poem going, like a stone rolling down a hill or something. And ideally, what you want it to be is beyond your control, and coming up with things. I mean, a simple way of putting it would be coming up with things that sound good, that you couldn't have come up with yourself, but the poem is doing. And so what that looks like when I'm drafting is that, I mean, unfortunately, most poems don't do this. This is the annoying thing. They just lie there and they're kind of just still. So you'll sit in a chair and try and sweat out one decent line, and then, oh my God, another decent line, please, you know, and nothing happens. But if on the rare occasions that it gets going, what happens is that I have to walk around the room and chant the poem, really. Yeah. And it's that, because I think basically I see poems as an oral form, really. They're what happens when someone speaks the poem. And the page is the best way of representing that. That's the way that I see it. So hopefully what's happening at that point is that the poem is coming up with things that you couldn't have got to yourself. But this is a rare thing. And then what happens is that at the editing stage, I sort of see that as, in a way, the point at which I'm trying to reinsert control. This is going to be months after probably the first burst. I mean, I was working on a poem recently about rabbits, which it comes from, as lots of these poems do, it comes from a story that my dad tells about when he had pet rabbits as a kid and they were in the backyard and his family were butchers. So it doesn't, you can guess what happened to these rabbits, unfortunately. But in the drafting process, I had a last line, which musically, it was very melodramatic last line, but musically it was kind of interesting. I didn't know what on earth it meant or its relationship to the rest of the poem. So at that point, I went back and tried to come up with a last line which really would answer and be, you know, work emotionally in the context of the poem, and tried to manage the music so it didn't sound duff or anything like that. And I was happy with that ending at the editing stage. But the more that time goes on, the more that original ending actually reasserts itself, and the authority of that, I still don't know what it means. But I think that's definitely how I see music. Is a way of giving life to Frankenstein's monster or something. Like the poem has got to be given a heartbeat and a life which is beyond you if it's going to be anything.
And part of the process is discovering what the meaning is of what's being presented by the music of the poem, or So, and I love that idea of you walking around. I do it too, actually. If I'm really stuck, I would actually go out and walk, and it's the rhythm of the walking that can bring something back. It's really a matter of faith, of relinquishing control of the poem in the service of the poem, I suppose.
Yes, absolutely. The incredibly annoying thing is that most of the time it doesn't happen,
Yeah, quite.
Another way I think of it is that you're looking for a poem to be two things, really. And I don't think that works. I don't know. It doesn't work usually if you've already got the two things in your head when you sit down to write. If you've got one and the second one comes as a discovery. In order to write, I sort of need a daft idea a lot of the time. My poems are quite often built around quite daft ideas. I sort of need that to get into the chair. And what I'm hoping will happen is that a more important one will emerge through the writing.
Nature features a fair bit in your poetry, and especially animals of various sorts. So you mentioned one there, and I'm thinking as well of seals, hippos, flamingos. So we're going to listen next to novelist Martin McInnes on the idea of nature in literature.
The existence of the word is the beginning of the problem. Nature. If we can name it, then we can say we are not it. We can create a distance, put nature outside of us. It's something else. We can look at it, point to it. It's limited. It's over there. It feels safe and reassuring to look at things this way. But it has led to disaster. And literature is as culpable in this regard as any of the arts. Terms have been coined to describe novels that do not ignore climate catastrophe and ecological collapse. Cli-fi, eco-fiction, speculative fiction. This is inevitable and dispiriting. It ghettoises the subject, claims it as marginal, a deviation from the mainstream. Cli-fi is especially revealing, bracketing such stories alongside science fiction as imaginative dystopias, rather than the realism they increasingly appear to be. I don't think it's overwrought to suggest that actually the reverse is true, and it's novels that don't address what's happening that are fantasy. Every writer is a nature writer, regardless of subject and intention. There's no way out of this. If it exists, it's natural. Artifice is just nature one step removed. Picture a familiar literary scene. A character sitting in an armchair by a window in a room lit by a fire. It's the end of the day. The window looks out onto rolling fields, a flock of finches in silhouette against the last of the sun. The character remarks to himself that he is looking out onto nature, enjoying nature. But he isn't. He's wrong. The construction assumes a place and a state of non-nature for the character to be in. And this isn't possible. The character, like the fields, the finches, the cloud of insects, is natural, hence vulnerable too. It's this gulf, this determination to see characters as outside of nature that continues to make the climate emergency seem, for many, provisional, deniable, a non-ultimate threat. Whatever disaster is occurring on the other side of the window, the character, sheltering by the fire, is safe. He cannot be got at. He is a separate entity. This remains, in spite of all evidence, and in spite of the great damage it has done, a dominant philosophy in Anglo-American literature.
So what's your response listening to that, John?
I loved that piece. I've got to be honest. It was really thought-provoking in terms of my writing. I love what you said about problematizing the relationship between nature writing and non-nature writing. You know, that every writer is a nature writer. And it made me think about a lot of things. particularly actually the way that my writing is rooted in place. So the way that the place is so important, and the particular layout of the South Wales valleys. And I mean, my childhood was like, roaming around hillsides and making dens and imagining pirate ships and all that sort of stuff. So you've got these villages which are sort of like, shaped like bowls, really, because you've got kind of hills all around you. And there's something about just the fact of kind of like walking around all through your life in, surrounded by these hills, which are beautiful, but they're also kind of enclosing. And that gives you a wonderful interconnectedness to the people around you. It's fabulously sort of gossipy places. It also makes you, I think, intensely interested in history. You can't see very far, I suppose. So then you start thinking about the other people who walk this part of the world in the past. So you're kind of intensely connected to those people. But that's all really created by the layout of those places.
You're making me think actually of Under Milk Wood, the gossipy feel of the of the area. Do you think that played a part in his in the composition?
Oh, for sure, yeah. One of my all-time favorite texts, just absolutely hilarious, yeah, and gets the people in those places for sure.
You think it captures them?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's exaggerated, obviously, and caricatured, but yeah, no, they're recognizable people up and down the street for sure. Yeah.
And it's interesting, as you said, isn't it, that the idea that Martin was talking about of the sort of othering of nature, that by giving it a capital N and it's a word of its own, we're sort of othering it and distancing ourselves from it in some way. So thinking about your poem, The Hippo, the speaker there is a visitor in a zoo, I think, sort of longing for the hippo to rise up out of the water and show its face. And I suppose zoos reinforce that idea of nature as somehow other. But is that how you experience it? What draws you to the subject of nature in your writing, or to animals?
Yeah, it is really interesting, and this is one of the reasons why I found the clip interesting. Because if someone had asked me, "Am I a nature writer?" I would have said no. I mean, mainly I'm writing quite often about TV or about something in pop culture or something my dad said or something like that. So when I'm writing about nature, I'm choosing to do so because it feels like an exception to the body of my work. So going to a zoo is because it's a man-made space. So I'm specifically seeking out those animals and those interactions. I think there's something about sort of festival-like spaces, sort of slightly sort of super real spaces like zoos, museums. I've never tried this, but I think it would work in like a theme park or a carnival. Or there's something about the specialness and the energy of those places which can set off poems. Because of the music of poetry, I think that the wonderful thing about animal poems is poems are uniquely placed to, I think, articulate the joy of nature and like the weirdness and like the amazing thing that you're seeing in front of you. An obvious example for me in this is Hopkins. Like the way that Hopkins articulates the joy of the natural, and ecstasy really is the word, of
the wind hover, or
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, you can feel, and actually, there's a little bit of that in the hippo. This sort of being led by the words, as we were talking about before, being led by the sound of the words and what those words suggest about the creature that you're trying to bring to life for us.
Yeah, the writing of that poem was very strange because it appeared like the poem already existed or something like that, and I was just reading it. It really came in that way, and you've always got to be careful not to be nostalgic about different periods of writing because it makes the present more problematic.
And
I
it
think
always happens a different way, doesn't it?
Exactly. But that really did just feel as though it came as a gift. I mean, the other person I should mention in this context is my really dear friend, Catherine Bevis, who writes in an extraordinary way about the natural world and the interconnectedness that the clip was talking about. And the way that the natural world can offer us a way of understanding mortality, understanding love, just the most extraordinary writer, I think, in terms of the natural world.
Oh, that's a good plug for Catherine Bevis there. She'll be very pleased with that. Well, being an award winner yourself, John, you know all about success. But even award winners experience the opposite from time to time. And as poets, we have the luxury of sending work out along the way while the overall book is in progress, which is great. But of course, it means laying yourself open to repeated rejections. So we're going to listen now to poet Debjani Chatterjee on dealing with rejection.
Writers and poets should not be depressed by rejection. Of course, no one hopes for rejection, but if it comes, we could see it as a learning opportunity. Wearing my creative arts psychotherapist hat, I often give clients this advice. It's common sense, of course, in line with the saying, the person who never made a mistake never learned anything. We writers encounter many such learning opportunities. Rejection, especially repeated rejection, is hard. Many of us, perhaps especially poets, think we are particularly sensitive people, so find rejection the harder. I find it hard too, but decided early on that if I was serious about my career, I must cope with editors and publishers who turn down my work and proposals, and who frequently do not even do the courtesy of replying. Of course, there are rejection letters and rejection letters. Some are the briefest of dismissals. In such cases, I tell myself, never mind, it'll be published somewhere better, and they'll regret having turned it down. There are other rejection letters in which an editor kindly gives feedback, and these merit attention. A consequence of overly sensitive feelings can be that a writer never sends out work to publishers. I have seen this enough times. Some writers restrict themselves to sending stories, novels, plays to the same editors over and over again, because they have had work accepted by them in the past and dare not send their work elsewhere for fear of rejection. When I was mentoring poets for Survivors Poetry, I found all my mentees adversely affected to some degree by rejection. It was not enough to say that I valued their work and found it publishable. So, in some cases, I actually sent off their work and only informed them when I knew that a magazine would publish it.
So, rejection as a learning opportunity, what do you make of that?
I think it's brilliant advice. I think it's exactly the advice to follow. The number of times I've sort of sent out a poem sort of 12 times and you'd know, and then the 13th or even 43rd time, you'll get something. The one that sort of made me see all this as a bit of a farce really was I'd sent something out sort of 12 times and no. And it ended up doing really well in a competition, which was a bigger thing than any of the things I'd already sent it to. But part of the prize was that it got published somewhere that had already rejected it as a submission to the magazine.
Sweet justice.
Yeah. And not only that, then the editor started saying, well, have you got any other poems we can publish? Well, yeah, I have. I've got the last 10 years of poems I've been sending you.
That I've sent to you already. Brilliant.
So I think the advice is fabulous. But the problem is that I think the heart doesn't take advice, because the heart's a bit of an idiot. So you can't really advise the heart. The heart only knows love me, that's all it can process.
So well put, yes.
So when the rejection comes, I think we experience it bodily. And I think, my goodness, the despair, the way that it very quickly dismantles all of the things you've been basing sort of flimsy self-belief on, really.
And it takes such a long time, doesn't it, to send stuff out, wait for it to be read, and then, wait for the verdict to come back. It's a long process.
Yeah, it's a whole business for sure. It's a job in itself and full of so many pitfalls of like management of, making sure you just send to one place and all that sort of malarkey.
Well, I think you might be about to give advice on maybe dealing with rejection, or do you have any advice on dealing with rejection?
No. The thing about it is, like, I think that when it lands, the thing is that the way that it appears, I mean, I'm old enough that I can still remember the kind of brown envelopes dropping onto the mat, and you're kind of, taking the weight, before you open it. Have they kept one? Or is this still the weight of 6 poems? But now it's submittable and it's automated emails and it's even, not even your name, it's dear writer. And the problem is, in the moments after, the way that it feels like the judgment of an all-knowing being, actually, on the sum total of your worth. That's how it feels. You don't rationalize it as an individual poem which didn't fit for this one person. It feels like the judgment of some super being who's weighed everything up about, your soul or something.
Yes.
But I think the solution, by law, these people, these editors, these scoundrels, should be forced to drive round to everyone's house that they are rejecting and arrive on the door. They have to drive up in a bashed up, rusty Nissan Micra.
Absolutely.
That has to be the law.
Not that there's anything wrong with Nissan Micras, by the way.
Well,
I used to own one.
We should go into reproduction. This is going to boost the sales of Nissan Micras if we go in this direction. And they have to look into your eyes and they have to apologize. And while they're doing that, there has to be a visible blob of Marmite on their clothing. That should be the way this works. Because the reality is, editors are poorly paid. They're 5,000 poems for 50 places, all of that sort of stuff. But we don't feel that when the rejection comes. It's very difficult to feel that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I did used to find it useful very early on. It was quite valuable when the rare instances that Debjani talked about when you got advice on a rejection slip. That's how I first got my early poems
me too.
Published and thought, oh, you don't like that line? Right, okay, I'll rewrite that. And then just sent them right back. I mean, maybe it's a naive thing to do, but they kind of had to take them. This is in the days of the brown envelope.
Yeah, and I loved handwritten rejection notes because sometimes there were some editors I was really targeting and their handwriting was so bad that when it came back, I couldn't tell. So I pretended to myself that it was an acceptance, and scrutinise it under a microscope. But they've taken it. No, they haven't.
Oh. Anyway, as you say, editors are not always right. So we talked about how inspiring teachers can be, but often it's another writer who provides us with the right kind of motivation just at the moment when we most need it. So here is travel writer Julian Sayre on some advice that he received while working as a bicycle courier. And it's from one of the UK's biggest literary names.
Writing advice was never something that I sought out. I always wrote anyway, compulsively, which probably means that my own advice, the advice I actually follow myself, is to pursue a policy of trial and error. To improve, I read other writers analytically, and I collage together what I like of theirs with my own style and the voices in my head that still, mercifully, keep feeding me sentences from time to time. But there is one line of advice that I was given by chance and that I have since found useful. Because of the story attached to my receiving this piece of advice, it has always stayed firmly in my head along with the wintry day where I received it. For years before I was published, I worked as a cycle courier in London, delivering the documents and the goods of the metropolis. I went up and down the lifts with evangelical Christian security guards, and I delivered receivership notices to failed US banks. The firm that I worked for also had the Random House contract, out of the company's headquarters then down by the Thames, and where one cold morning I collected a book parcelled in cardboard and going up to Fitzrovia. The parcel was for one Ian McEwan, a name I knew from a free paperback of his that had one day dropped out of a weekend paper. I hadn't and haven't read that or any other of his books, and have a mistrust of most authors it becomes too safe to applaud. But a half hour later I stood on his doorstep, and a familiar-looking man with spectacles and swept-back silver hair answered, and seemed cheered that the delivery boy on his cold doorstep dressed all working class and salt of the earth against the cold, knew who he was. I asked his advice for an aspiring author, and he looked up for a moment and thought, before saying precisely, "Write, every day, at least 300 words." It was good advice. Practical, achievable, objective, and immune to differences in creative interpretation. It was also good advice in the comfort it provides on those few days when I write nothing at all, when I am able to do so, safe in the knowledge that I am still only at most 300 words under my target for the day. And so I write, at least 300 words, every day. That was the advice I took and continue to practice. The rest is up to me.
It's a lovely anecdote, that, isn't it? Are there any writers who've offered you memorable advice or otherwise inspired you?
Yeah, so the advice was the same, to be honest. I wish there was as glamorous a story about cycling around London to go with it. If I knew where Ian McEwan lived, I think I'd be pitching a tent outside, and keeping an eye on it.
Yeah.
But no, it happened at an Arvin, and it was Hugo Williams, who I absolutely love Hugo Williams' work. But his advice was basically the same: of all you can do with poetry is to keep at it, and try and write one poem a month. And what he said was, and this is probably to misquote, or to misremember, but it was the way that I heard it and the way that I've internalized it. He said, "You can't do anything about the quality of your writing. What you can do something about is that you keep showing up and you keep creating the text." Or as a friend of mine says, you have to be the champion of sitting down. That's one of the biggest battles, is getting yourself into the chair and making something happen. And I love that piece of advice because it took the pressure off. And I think that that's really one of the things that I've got to work at, actually, is continually taking the pressure or expectation off a piece of writing at the start of it. So it sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier about trying to sit down to write a daft idea. If I've got a daft idea, there's more chance of me getting into the chair than with something serious. And I hope something serious will happen, but I need to know that I can go into a room and write something daft. Or as David Morley, who was my writing teacher in university, used to say, give yourself the permission to write badly. Is really important.
Similar sort of piece of advice, isn't it?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, pressure is a destroyer of poems, isn't it? For some people, although I was talking to somebody recently who found the pressure of a deadline absolutely necessary to create something, and said that she wouldn't write without that. So it's interesting what works for different people. But Hugo's advice to you about it was quite specific, wasn't it? In the end, one poem, as long as you write one poem a month, similar to Ian McEwan's thing about the 300 words a day. And I find those bits of advice are the most useful because they're manageable and they're practicable. So turning it around, what advice do you find yourself giving most often?
So the thing that I say a fair bit, and I don't know if it helps people, is basically imagine that you're sitting down to say the poem to a friend. There's something about the act of writing a poem which complicates or makes people take on very grand airs, oh my goodness, I'm writing a poem, it's got to be complicated and I've got to hint at things and all that sort of stuff. So, I mean, a lot in my mentoring work, the biggest problem that people come up against is that the poem that's in their head or that they think they've written is not there on the page. So I'll read the poem and I'll think, well, what on earth? I don't know what's going on. And then I'll speak to them in a mentoring session and they'll say, well, this is the time that my Auntie Lily, it was her 100th birthday, and we invited Stephen Hendry round for tea and we thought he wouldn't come, but then he showed up at the last minute and had this lovely chat, and this reminded me of an incident that happened with my uncle in a snooker club. And I'm like, well, that's all absolutely brilliant.
But none of it's there.
Yeah. And then they'll say, oh, well, I did use the word queue, and I'm not right. So that, I mean, I say to them, what you just said was amazing, but you just need to say that into a tape recorder if you need to, or they're showing my age there with a tape recorder, whatever recording device is available. And then think about how that can inform your poem, get some line breaks in. But this is not particularly exciting, but a lot of poems, I think, is information management. It's about, does the reader know enough to feel, basically? Yes. And so that very definitely is something I keep coming back to. How would you say this to a friend?
It's a brilliant piece of advice, I think. And sometimes I think the condensing of the poem goes on a bit too early. Or it's like a composer having the orchestra in their head and they're writing the melody and they're expecting the reader or the listener to hear that whole orchestra, but only they can hear it. So it's putting that in. So I think that is a wonderful piece of advice. Any other words of advice?
So one of my favorite things, and unfortunately is something I don't think I practice very often myself, but Liz Berry once said something like, be hard on the poem and kind to the poet. Be hard on the poem and kind to the poet. And I think, if I could get someone to look after me sometimes as a poet, I'd want someone to say, really, everything's going to be okay, and you've written well before and you'll write well in the future. Because so often the voice in your head is saying things which are very different to that. So I think we all need to be our own writing best friend, really.
I think that's wonderful advice, and it overlaps with your first bit of advice. Very wise words, John. John, it's been really great to talk to you today. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.